just like to begin by saying, well, first of all, welcome everybody, and it's a huge privilege and a joy for me to be here tonight on this event, and also with Ruth. I think part of what's already happening tonight, and what I want to talk about is that there's forces, energies in this earth and in this world of beyond our wildest dreams, probably, and certainly beyond our conscious comprehension. And that's, to me, a great deal of what the experience of wilderness is about. And those energies are already working this evening. They're part of what's brought us here. And it's extraordinary to me what Ruth was just saying about water, because I had already decided I was going to start with an anecdote about water. And I was going to share an experience I had some years ago in the wilderness. It was actually at South Cape Rivulet. And I've always tended to underestimate that place, because my feelings about wilderness are that the more remote, the better it is. To me, some of the most powerful places are the very remote places. And South Cape Rivulet is not particularly remote. And it gets a lot of usage, got a lot of visitation. But at the same time, it's a very powerful place and a very beautiful place. It's a place where tall forest comes down almost to the sea's edge. And you have this extraordinary contrast of the placid lagoon only metres away from the fury of the Southern Ocean. I'd been away from the state for several months, and this was my first trip back into the wilderness. And I was walking along the beach and just turning that corner where you get to see the lagoon when it hit me. And I'll do my best to put it into words, but in that lagoon and in the surrounding area, there was the essence of the whole wilderness. The lagoon was carrying the essence of all the wilderness. The rainforests and the tall forests, and the peaks and the plains, and the sandstone shelves, and the dolerite columns, and the lakes and the waterfalls, and the storms and the snows, and the infernally hot summer days, and the buzz of march flies, and the call of the currawong, and the Arsophis tasmanica, and the dawns and the dusks. It was all there, like distilled in the water. What I'm saying is that what was coming in that river was not just water, it was a river of power. The power of the wilderness was flowing down into that lagoon. I've been walking into wilderness for 50 years now. Somewhere along the line, very early on when I was a teenager, something started to seep into me from the wilderness, and I didn't know what it was. And a lot of my life, the story of my life really, has been trying to work it out, if I can put it that way, because I realized very early on there was something tremendously, for want of a better word, important in what I was experiencing. Something magical, something profound, something very deep and beautiful. And it was something I couldn't explain or understand or interpret in the terms of the educational upbringing that I had, which was essentially a white guy from southwest London. I was raised as a child in a town called Youghal, somewhere sort of half between a suburb and a village on the outskirts of London. And the word Youghal actually is Anglo-Saxon for spring or source of the river. And I only learned quite recently that the spring that was just down the end of the road from where I lived was actually a sacred site in prehistoric times. As a child, I was oblivious to that, but perhaps at some level it influenced me in ways that influenced the rest of my life. But so anyway, as a young man, as a teenager and as a young man, I was first of all struck with this kind of dichotomy within me, which has been there my whole life. Is what's going on? How can I understand this? Because the culture in which I was brought up hasn't given me the words or the language or the concepts or the framework or anything to make sense of this. And also, how do I convey this importance to another person who doesn't see it? Because obviously, from even before I set foot in the wilderness, I was aware of the fact that the wilderness was under threat and being destroyed. I knew about the threat to PETA even before I left the UK. Now, it's been some consolation to me that I wasn't the only person having these feelings. If I had been, I would have been quite worried. But I mean, I've got a few quotes here, and this one is from the logbook on Hall's Island, Lake Malbina. It is these mountains that beckon me with the sort of painful magnetic pull to walk deeper and deeper in their beauty. That's just in the logbook. Somebody's really getting it. And I mean, I relate to that because, I mean, I wouldn't call it painful, but certainly kind of an insistent magnetic pull is what's taken me back out to the wilderness again and again all these years. This sense of, this attraction, this immense invitation to experience what the wilderness has to offer. Now, one of the things that's clear is that this paradigm that I'm talking about, let's call it, for sake of argument, the Western paradigm, the dominant paradigm, which is still dominant on this planet, very, very much so. It's very ignorant still of the natural world, and we're beginning to learn more and more about this natural world now. And just one example, some years ago, I was in a situation a bit like this, and Ruth, at the end of a talk about wilderness, said, we shouldn't be cutting down all the old trees, because if we do, the young trees won't have anyone to teach them. And now that's really struck me at the time, and I thought, well, I don't disagree with that, but I don't, how does it work? And yet in the intervening years, science has discovered that trees do talk to each other. They do communicate through their root systems and through the air, through chemicals. So a forest is not just a bunch of individuals, it's a community of beings. And I also read recently that there's these things that trees emit called phytoncides, which lower blood pressure, reduce stress, boost immunity. So going into a forest is actually very good for you. And soil microbes also, they've now discovered, can improve mental health. They help to alleviate depression. So those of you who've, in the past, have been knee-deep in mud on the South Coast track or slogging along the Loddon Plains, you now know why you were enjoying yourself so much. And a time will probably come when we'll pull out all the duckboard because we realise it's making us depressed. You may have heard that there's a movement now to start bestowing legal personhood on things like rivers and mountains and so forth. This is just starting to happen. I do see it somewhat ironical that in the United States a corporation can be a person, but a living ecosystem can't. But in some countries like India and recently in New Zealand, rivers and some other natural features are being recognised as persons, which in a legal sense gives them standing in court, basically. But the deeper message of this is that rivers are living things. And I was reading a little bit about rivers recently, about floods, how they flood, and the systems of rapids and the deposition and so forth. And the more you look into it, the more you realise that rivers are intelligent. Mm-hmm. They're not simply water running downhill. There's a whole story there. And part of what I wanted to say tonight is my realisation that the earth itself is intelligent. The nature is intelligent and it is alive. You see, well, I'll go the whole way and say, well, the crux of it is this, that I'll put it this way, because bearing in mind that words are limited, that human beings do not have a monopoly on mind. We think that this brain that this particular biped mammal has is what does mind. But what we do is only a form of mind, and the thinking is actually quite limited. And I don't think mammals or quadrupeds have a monopoly on mind either. I go so far as to say that there's mind in all living things, and there's mind in the earth, and there's mind in being itself, and probably ultimately there's mind in non-being. You see that there's so much depth in this, and ironically, our science has actually touched on these things. It's reached places where logic breaks down, relativity theory, quantum theory, and so forth. Places where the division between the observer and the observed no longer applies. This was discovered over 100 years ago, but the implications of it haven't, for some reason, filtered through, even in the scientific community, let alone community generally. We're not seeing it. But you see, to say that there was mind in the earth, it may sound rather strange, because you see, Alan Watts, some of you may have heard of, he was a bit of a guru back in the 60s and 70s and earlier. Very smart guy. But one of the things he said was that he talked about our paradigm of we have a ceramic model of the universe. And what he meant by that, it was a beautiful way of putting it, because, I mean, he was talking about both religion and science, Western religion and Western science. The Judeo-Christian religion is that Adam was made out of clay, and then Eve was made out of a spare rib. And in science also, as science, Newtonian physics and so forth, is that we're all looking at the interaction of stuff. That there's basically stuff. The universe is so much stuff, and then how does it all put together, right? But quantum mechanics tells us that the stuff is only there when the mind sees it, essentially. How do you resolve that? Well, I suspect the answer may be that actually there's no difference between mind and matter, fundamentally, that they are basically essentially the same thing. And the implication of that is that this clever little brain, which natters away to itself, it's only a little isolate, or thinks it's an isolate from much vaster mind. The reason I'm raving on about all this is because I feel this in wilderness. It's not just theory. It's one of the things I felt for a long time. When I'm out there on my own, I'm not on my own. There's a sense that I'm in with a living thing, a living being that's not alien. And you see, the idea that we have a superior mind and that the earth is just stuff is so absurd, because we came from the earth, not the other way around. I mean, it's so obvious. This cosmos gave existence to us, not us to it. So our message is partly that the hills are alive, not necessarily in the sense that Julia Andrews meant it, but the mountains are alive. They have their own stories. They have their own dignity, their own sense of being. And in wilderness, one senses that there's this vast conversation going on between the rains and the forests and the mountains and the rock. This immense conversation, for want of a better word, that's been going on for billions of years. And you can feel it. You can tune into it. And I won't go on for too much longer, but what I want to say is this, that I think the time has come for us to explore that. to find out this deeper truth about nature and our place in it. With all the chaos that's going on in the world, it's as good a time as any to go for broke. And I'm saying this as much to myself because I feel constrained. I have felt constrained. I write sort of scientific stuff about wilderness, or academic stuff. Sorry, not about wilderness. And I always feel that the kind of things I've just been talking about are taboo because I say them. There's a danger I'll be looked upon as some kind of crank. And after all, greenies are still accused of being tree huggers, which apparently is a negative thing. And of being emotional, which apparently is a negative thing. And you're being irrational, which apparently is a negative thing. So you see, there's this, you get frowned on, but the time has come to speak our truth about this. And the truth for me, I mean, I don't pretend to understand it, but I do think the time has come to admit that there's something much greater to be discovered in the natural world. What we need is a different form of consciousness, because the rational brain is not going to be able to put its arms around this. It can't. I'm talking to you in words, and words, they have a certain resonance, obviously, they have a certain depth, but thinking is in time. It's a chain of ideas in time, like beads on a chain. It's linear, and nature is not linear. Nature is vastly complex and interrelated, and beyond all that, beyond all the lines and words and concepts. So what we need is an intelligence that's beyond lines and words and concepts. And funnily enough, one good place to find that very consciousness is in wilderness itself. Because when you go into wilderness, you go beyond the word, particularly if you go to places that aren't named. There's no... time has a different meaning altogether out there. Wilderness doesn't do this human-obsessed trip of acquisition and me and you and us and them, and this hard distinction between life and death. There's something much more organic and interrelated and whole about the experience. And you sense that. One senses it. When you go into wilderness, it seeps into you, and the learning is non-verbal. It's cellular. You feel it through your skin, your lungs, as Ruth was saying. You through your eyes, you breathe it in. It's there in the mountain air. So I encourage you to go bush again. Thank you.
I'd like to pick up on what you're talking about. What I heard is a real call to go deeper into our own inquiry into expanded consciousness. So I think I'd like to just build on that, if that's okay.
Please do.
Great. Thank you. Just so I can sort of know who's in the room and where we're at, if I say to you, trees talk, if you are in the affirmative, if you believe that, just raise your hand. There's no judgment around yes or no, because we are multiple thought beings. If I was to say to you, if you have a pet at home, a dog or a cat or something like that, you very clearly can communicate, not just you can feel it, but you feel like there's a conversation. Do you agree with that? You can talk to your dog or something like that. Okay. Where are we at with talking to rocks? Yeah. Okay, excellent. Great. What about dreams? Where are we at with dreaming? Do people feel that dreams are either, usually I find that this is the spectrum. Dreams are the mind getting rid of rubbish, just continuing to analyse the day. And then the other is for profound potential insights from there. So if, depending on where you're at, just raise your hand up. This is the mind just formulating junk, and this is, I have the potential to talk to the cosmos. Okay, great. Okay. Does that make sense to you, what I just said?
Yeah, sure.
Great,
Yeah.
okay. Good. So I've been very blessed to have been born to an Australian father and an Aboriginal mother, who gave me a sense of spirituality from, my father was Seventh-day Adventist, and my mother would probably be called a songwoman witch, like in the, that metaphor. We call her songwoman, but, you know, she could mediate between spirit and matter. And so I grew up with this vast, sometimes at seeming odds, I thought they were at odds, and this understanding of the formation of existence. And then through my life, both through a lot of drugs, really, trauma, alcohol, streets, domestic violence, I learnt a lot from sorrow and grief and anger. And then from the beauty of the wild country, you know, deep ocean, beautiful valleys, I learnt a lot about love. And then I also learnt a lot from seeing. And part of that was in a sleep consciousness, where dreams would come to me very clearly as we're having this conversation here. And other times, particularly during my younger years, I would have clear visions, awakenings. Now, because of my upbringing within the Western civilization, I was told to fear that. I was taught that I was experiencing psychosis, and they were pathologizing me as being mad. And I was very, very blessed to actually start travelling around the world and sitting with Indigenous elders from all sorts of different backgrounds, including Celtic, all sorts of Ainu from Japan, you know, people from all over the world who basically I'd go, oh my God, I'm losing my mind. I'm hearing voices and I'm seeing these things, and this tree talked to me, and that rock told me to do that, and oh my God, I just went to Mars. Ah! And they were going, oh yeah. Tell me about it. Oh, yeah, didn't so-and-so, yeah, she went to there. Yeah. And I was like, oh, thank God. Yes, I have found a way where I can exist without being considered the freak. You were talking about, you know, the tree huggers, often within the census society, being the freak. And it wasn't until I met Stanislav Grof, who is he was a pioneer in the use of psychedelics in the 50s and 60s. And he worked a lot with Hoffman and a whole heap of other people who looked at using plant medicines and psychedelics to access a broader reach of what they called non-ordinary states. Now, I had been, thank goodness, sitting with a whole heap of people that weren't saying that that was not ordinary. They were actually saying that sense of broadening our abilities to know that we are connected is our human birthright. that humanity through the Newtonian Cartesian Western science mind is actually de-evolving, and that our consciousness is actually coming into a very limited way, a state of being to be able to relate to all things. So that when we should have the plethora of the universe to learn about who we are, what purpose is, what the potential is in this moment, when that is crushed down, it's actually what's now known within a lot of seers as a parasitic form of consciousness. It's actually devouring the earth itself when we're limiting ourselves to this form of consciousness. And that we understand that through the schooling systems and through the broader indoctrinations, what's happening is these ancient cultural ways of being, which is our human birthright, to understand that, of course, when somebody dies, you just relate to them in a different way. Of course they'll come and visit you. Of course you can go to another planet if you go to your dreaming. Of course, how do you think? Like, this blows me out. Like, anybody know the Seven Sisters, the Pleiades thing? So it's this tiny little cluster of stars. It's tiny. We see it in the summer through the billions of star systems that are out there. It's like, if you didn't know where it is, it's not like the Southern Cross, is it? It's not like the Evening Star. It's this tiny little cluster of things. Now, in our traditions, we're very clear that they're my relations there. Like in Kimberley country, when you're born, you automatically understand your lineage is not only between who your skin lineage is, you know who you come from, who you're galactically connected to. So this little cluster of seven sister star are throughout most of the dreaming stories of creation to remind us that we're so much more, that we have all this potential of love and connection and source of support, a source of the wellness of who we can be to grow. And so here in Australia, for how many hundreds of thousands of years, we know that they are our ancestral connections. We have other connections to other things. And then we go to, when I went to Japan, I was really surprised. They go, oh yeah, we know those sisters. Ah, and I'm like, who know, how do you know these sisters? Like, oh yeah, for thousands of years. We call them Subaru. You know, they're like the 7 dot sisters on the thing. Subaru. The Greeks call them Pleiades. So we know that these are ancient civilizations who had no direct, hey, you know, that little thing out there, a little bit there. So we know that there is a broader way that we connect and we communicate. I would not be as blown away if it would have been a very clear evening star. And of course we have song stories around the creation beings of these. But when we get something as powerful as the Pleiades that are across civilizations, geographically separated from the time, yet the stories, the meaning behind those stories are the same. Now that's interesting. And for basically, it gives me a lot of hope. It shows that a lot of our potential as human beings are actually just starting to re-emerge as we're having these conversations around understanding that there is a broader intelligence that permeates every single being alive, dead, beyond the chair itself, we know holds knowledge systems. It's just, you know, some people learn to talk to a dog. Some people learn a new language. You know, it takes time to learn it. Some people learn how to talk to trees. Some people learn how to talk to rivers and rocks. Other people learn how to talk to all beings. Now, we know it within the traditions, there's shamanic practices, there's meditation practices, there's all sorts of technologies that are out there that can enliven us to awaken to a new expanded consciousness. Well, we're actually just reclaiming this consciousness. That's our human birthright, our capacity to awaken to that we know the reality of our connection. And importantly, what it does is it brings us back to understanding not only intention, because we can get lost in the surface of, I have this intention, but it drops deeper into the universal call to know purpose. Andy Blackwater, he talks about the epidemic of loneliness that's sweeping the planet, that really is about the narrow minding of consciousness, and really the reawakening that when you know purpose, you know that you matter, then you have the opportunity to expand love across the universe. I think that's something well worth thinking about. Any thoughts?
It frightens me that there are so many people that are disconnected from the messages and the thoughts that you're providing to us today, and that there is a fear that's so pervasive that it prevents people from actually getting out there into the wilderness. That frightens me.
When Ruth and I were talking a little bit about this the other day, the world is a scary place, especially now, it seems. We seem, it would be enough if there was just one asteroid bearing down on us, but there's about 50, all of our own making. But to just one thing I'd say, sort of continuing what we've been saying. One of the rewards, for want of a better word, of having this kind of connection that we've been talking about, even if it's as simple as having a place in the wilderness that you really feel close to and at home in, you have a sense of being. I've just used the analogy of the roots of a tree, of being rooted in the ground, rooted in the cosmos. There's a sense of being connected to this greater thing. And that sense of being connected gives you, I feel, a certain resilience to withstand the kind of fear you're talking about. And also, it gives you the kind of perspective that can see beyond the clouds of the immediate future and the things you read in the media and so forth, which is not in any way to try to play down their significance. But part of the lesson of all this is that we don't know we don't know the full story. We can't see the big picture. At best, we can see beyond a very little picture. So what will play out will play out. But I do think that by exploring the kind of consciousness that Ruth's been talking about, that we've been talking about in wilderness, it gives you a kind of courage. The fear becomes less of an issue because, after all, what have you got to lose, really?
The thing that I think is, it interests me a lot, that spend time out in the bush. You don't have to go way wild country to get the sense of awe. This, everything, the significance arises. And then you hear people say, and then we have to go back to the real world. And I'm like, which world do you living in? And so they're the things that I would like to see a bit flipped. I'd like to see, we're actually living in a paradigm that's actually based on madness. This is not real at all. And so how do we shift that? So the fear is actually in this engrossed consume. Don't feel, think. Rather than what tends to happen just by, actually, I was just about to say, just by being in the bush, things tend to go like, but I have been out with walkers that they're just, and they're just down, they're getting from point A to point B, and they're consuming that track just like they consume when they come back in. There's not a lot going on there. And so that's interesting because that wilderness, what you're talking about, this force that all these conscious beings are out, the consciousness itself, the life force is in abundance, and yet the is still happening. And conversely, somebody can be, I remember coming, like there was about a month where I felt like I was, and I could touch a concrete pylon and feel like I was in love with it. And, you know, it had nothing to do with the cluster of other beings who were full of the life force. This was a concrete thing, and I still felt the potential of the immense gratitude to the concrete pylon. Don't tend to feel that at the moment, but yeah, so I wonder about the conversations that say we have to have that our awakening can only happen in wilderness, because it can happen anywhere. We're not. It is all of the mother. Every single particle, a molecule, is of this.